Hello, citizens. Welcome back to another edition of Fantasy Talk with Terry Mandangle. That's me. I'm Terry. How are we doing today? I'm well. I hope you are too. Today we're going to be talking about wide receivers. We're going to be using the player prop tool from the bettingpros.com website. It's going to show us a consensus ranking from over 20 sports books from every player's receiving yards, receptions, anytime touchdown prop, and we're going to turn that into fantasy points, and then we're going to rank them. Before we get into that, if you don't mind dropping a like on the video and hitting the subscribe button, it really helps out the channel. All right, let's get into it. All right, as you can see here, the number one option this week is obviously going to be Ja'Marr Chase. We're going to have these two guys in the top tier. Number one, Ja'Marr Chase, projected for 90.8 receiving yards on 7.1 receptions and a 0.8 on the anytime touchdown. That would be good for 20.98 fantasy points. And he probably could have been in this tier on his own, but we're going to put Justin Jefferson in that tier as well. Minnesota wide receiver at Chicago this week. Going to be projected for 89 receiving yards on 6.5 receptions, 0.6 on the anytime touchdown. That would be 19 fantasy points. As you can see here on the tier list, we have them in the 18 plus points category. They're the only two players that are going to get you 18 plus points this week. Number one, Ja'Marr Chase. Number two, Justin Jefferson. All right, let's get into tier 2. This is going to be these three players right here from 3 to 5. Number 3, CeeDee Lamb, wide receiver for the Dallas Cowboys. They are going to be playing at Philadelphia on Thursday. He is projected to get 77.7 receiving yards on 6.7 receptions and 0.5 on the anytime touchdown, good for 17.47 fantasy points. Number 4, Malik Nabers, New York Giants wide receiver at Washington this week. He's projected for 78.1 receiving yards on 6.6 receptions and 0.5 on the anytime touchdown. That is going to be good for 17.41 fantasy points. And then Brian Thomas Jr., Jacksonville wide receiver, versus Carolina this week, projected for 76.7 receiving yards, 5.8 receptions, 0.6 on the anytime touchdown. That would be 17.07 fantasy points. These are going to be all the guys that can get you 17 to 18 fantasy points this week. As you can see here, number 3 on the list, on the tier list, and tier 2 is going to be CeeDee Lamb. Number 4, Malik Nabers. Number 5, Brian Thomas Jr. All right, the next tier is going to be players who can get you anywhere from 16 to 17 fantasy points. They're going to be from 6 to 9, Amon-Ra St. Brown down to Puka Nacua. We'll start with number 6, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Detroit wide receiver at Green Bay this week. Projected for 69.6 receiving yards on 6.7 receptions. Anytime touchdown is 0.5. That would get you 16.66 fantasy points. Number 7 on the list, Houston wide receiver Nico Collins at the LA Rams this week. Projected for 77.5 receiving yards on 5.9 receptions and 0.5 on the anytime touchdown. That would give you 16.65 fantasy points. Number 8, Tampa Bay wide receiver Mike Evans at Atlanta this week. Projected for 68.4 receiving yards on 5.6 receptions, 0.7 on the anytime touchdown, good for 16.64 fantasy points. And number 9, Puka Nacua, LA Rams wide receiver. He's going to be playing Houston this week. Projected for 75.6 receiving yards on 6.2 receptions, 0.4 on the anytime touchdown, good for 16.16 fantasy points. As you can see here in the tier list, the third tier is going to be players from 16 to 17 points. We've got number 6, Amon-Ra St. Brown, number 7, Nico Collins, number 8, Mike Evans, number 9, Puka Nacua. All right, the next tier we're going to have are players 10 through 14. Projected to get you anywhere from 15 to 16 fantasy points this week. Number 10 is Drake London, wide receiver for the Atlanta Falcons. He's going to be playing Tampa Bay this week. Projected for 68.2 receiving yards on 5.9 receptions. Anytime touchdown, 0.5. That is going to be good for 15.72 fantasy points. Number 11 on the list is going to be Tyreek Hill, wide receiver for the Miami Dolphins at Indianapolis this week. Projected for 67.8 receiving yards on 5.8 receptions, 0.5 on the anytime touchdown. That would be good for 15.58 fantasy points. All right, wide receiver number 12, Philadelphia Eagles wide receiver A.J. Brown, going to be playing the Dallas Cowboys this week. He is projected for 72.4 receiving yards on 5.2 receptions, 0.5 on the anytime touchdown. That would be good for 15.44 fantasy points. Number 13 on the list, T. Higgins, Cincinnati wide receiver at Cleveland this week. Projected for 63.7 receiving yards on 5.3 receptions, 0.6 on the anytime touchdown. That would be good for 15.27 fantasy points. Last in this tier would be number 14, Jackson Smith-Njigba, Seattle wide receiver, playing San Francisco this week. Projected for 63.1 receiving yards, 5.8 receptions, and 0.5 on the anytime touchdown. Good for 15.11 fantasy points. As you can see here, tier number 4, 15 through 16 points. Number 10, Drake London. Number 11, Tyreek Hill. Number 12, A.J. Brown. Number 13, T. Higgins. Number 14, Jackson Smith-Njigba. All right, we are moving into Tier 5. This is going to be players 15 through 24. This is going to be players that can get you anywhere from 13 to 15 fantasy points this week. We're going to start with number 15, Ladd McConkey, LA Chargers wide receiver, going to be playing the Kansas City Chiefs. Projected for 68.8 receiving yards on 5.6 receptions, 0.4 in the anytime touchdown. That would get you 14.88 fantasy points. Number 16, Terry McLaurin, Washington wide receiver versus the New York Giants this week. Projected for 61.9 receiving yards on 5.1 receptions, 0.5 on the anytime touchdown. That would get you 14.29 fantasy points. Number 17, Los Angeles Rams receiver Davante Adams, playing Houston this week. Projected for 60.9 receiving yards on 5 receptions, 0.5 on the anytime touchdown. That would be good for 14.09 fantasy points. Number 18, Kansas City wide receiver Xavier Worthy, playing the LA Chargers this week in Brazil. Projected for 57.7 receiving yards on 5.3 receptions. 0.5 on the anytime touchdown gets you 14.07 fantasy points. Number 19, Cleveland wide receiver Jerry Jeudy, playing Cincinnati this week. Projected for 67.5 receiving yards on 5.3 receptions. 0.3 on the anytime touchdown would get you 13.85 fantasy points. Number 20 wide receiver this week is Denver wide receiver Courtland Sutton, playing the Tennessee Titans. Projected for 59.2 receiving yards on 4.9 receptions, 0.5 on the anytime touchdown. That would get you 13.82 fantasy points. 21 wide receiver would be Baltimore Zay Flowers at Buffalo. 60.7 receiving yards projected on 5.1 receptions, 0.4 on the anytime touchdown. That would get you 13.57 fantasy points. Number 22 receiver on the list this week would be Devontae Smith. He is going to be playing the Dallas Cowboys. He is projected for 55.5 receiving yards on 4.9 receptions. 0.5 on the anytime touchdown. That would get you 13.45 fantasy points. Number 23 on the list would be Pittsburgh wide receiver DK Metcalf at the New York Jets this week. Projected for 62.8 receiving yards on 4.6 receptions. 0.4 on the anytime touchdown. That would be good for 13.28 fantasy points. And the final player in this tier would be number 24, Tetairoa McMillan, rookie wide receiver for the Carolina Panthers. He's going to be playing at Jacksonville this week, projected for 59.7 receiving yards on 4.9 receptions, 0.4 on the anytime touchdown. That would get you 13.27 fantasy points. All right, as you can see here, we have all the players that can get you 13 to 15 points here in Tier 5. It would be number 15, Ladd McConkey, number 16, Terry McLaurin, number 17, Davante Adams, number 18, Xavier Worthy. Number 19, Jerry Jeudy. Number 20, Courtland Sutton. Number 21, Zay Flowers. Number 22, Devontae Smith. Number 23, DK Metcalf. Number 24, Tetairoa McMillan. All right, the next tier are players that can get you anywhere from 11 to 13 fantasy points. It's a little bit bigger of a tier. It's going to start at 25 and go all the way down to 40. We're going to start with number 25, Marvin Harrison Jr., Arizona wide receiver. At New Orleans this week, projected for 58.6 receiving yards on 4.7 receptions, 0.4 on the anytime touchdown. That would get you 12.96 fantasy points. Number 26 would be Chicago wide receiver DJ Moore. They're going to be playing the Minnesota Vikings this week, projected for 53.5 receiving yards on 5.1 receptions. 0.4 on the anytime touchdown would be good for 12.85 fantasy points. Number 27 is Tampa Bay rookie wide receiver Emeka Egbuka at Atlanta this week, projected for 54.8 receiving yards on 4.9 receptions, 0.3 on the anytime touchdown. 0.4 on the anytime touchdown. That would get you 12.78 fantasy points. Number 28 on the list would be New York Jets wide receiver Garrett Wilson, playing the Pittsburgh Steelers. Projected for 56.5 receiving yards on 5.3 receptions, 0.3 on the anytime touchdown, good for 12.75 fantasy points. Number 29, Miami wide receiver Jalen Waddle at Indianapolis. Projected for 58.2 receiving yards on 5 catches, 0.3 on the anytime touchdown. That would be good for 12.62 fantasy points. Number 30, New Orleans wide receiver Chris Olave, playing the Arizona Cardinals this week. Projected for 53.7 receiving yards on 4.8 receptions, 0.3 on the anytime touchdown. Good for 11.97 fantasy points. Number 31, New England wide receiver Stephon Diggs, playing Las Vegas this week, projected for 48.5 receiving yards, 4.7 receptions, zero point 0.4 on the anytime touchdown. Good for 11.95 fantasy points. Number 32, Seattle wide receiver Cooper Kupp, playing San Francisco. Projected for 47.9 receiving yards on 4.7 receptions, 0.4 on the anytime touchdown. Good for 11.89 fantasy points. Number 33, Ricky Pearsall, San Francisco wide receiver at Seattle this week. Projected for 53.3. Projected for 53.9 receiving yards, 4.6 receptions, 0.3 on the anytime touchdown. Good for 11.79 fantasy points. Number 34, Tennessee wide receiver Calvin Ridley at Denver. Projected for 56.2 receiving yards on 4.2 receptions, 0.3 on the anytime touchdown. Good for 11.62 fantasy points. Number 35, Indianapolis wide receiver Michael Pittman, playing Miami this week. Projected for 48.9 receiving yards on 4.9 catches, 0.3 on the anytime touchdown. Good for 11.59 fantasy points. Number 36, Las Vegas wide receiver Jacoby Myers at New England. Projected for 50.7 receiving yards, 4.7 receptions, 0.3 on the anytime touchdown. Good for 11.57 fantasy points. Number 37 on the list would be Dallas wide receiver George Pickens at Philadelphia. Projected for 55.6 receiving yards on 4.2 catches, 0.3 on the anytime touchdown. Good for 11.56 fantasy points. Number 38, Jameson Williams from the Detroit Lions at Green Bay. Projected for 52.7 receiving yards on 3.8 catches, 0.4 on the anytime touchdown. Good for 11.47 fantasy points. Number 39, San Francisco wide receiver Juwan Jennings at Seattle. Projected for 50.8 receiving yards, 4.4 receptions, and 0.3 on the anytime touchdown. Good for 11.28 fantasy points. And the last player in this tier, number 40, Deebo Samuel, Washington wide receiver. Projected for 46.6 receiving yards on 4 catches, 0.4 on the anytime touchdown. That would get you 11.06 fantasy points. All right, as you can see here on the tier list, tier 6, 11 through 13 points. We're going to start with wide receiver 25. It's going to be Marvin Harrison. Number 26, DJ Moore. Number 27, Emeka Egbuka. Number 28, Garrett Wilson. Number 29, Jalen Waddle. Number 30, Chris Olave. Number 31, Stephon Diggs. Number 32, Cooper Kupp. Number 33, Ricky Pearsall. Number 34, Calvin Ridley. Number 35, Michael Pittman. Number 36, Jacoby Myers. Number 37, George Pickens. Number 38, Jameson Williams. Number 39, Juwan Jennings. Number 40 would be Deebo Samuel. All right, the last tier that we're going to talk about are guys that can get you 9 to 11 fantasy points. It's going to be receivers 41 through 50. We're going to start with 41, Khalil Shakir. Buffalo wide receiver, playing Baltimore this week, projected for 45.6 receiving yards on 4.5 receptions. 0.3 on the anytime touchdown would get you 10.86 fantasy points. Number 42 would be Jacksonville wide receiver Travis Hunter, taking on the Carolina Panthers, projected for 47.5 receiving yards, 4.3 receptions on 0.3 anytime touchdown. That would get you 10.85 fantasy points. Number 43, Chicago Bears receiver Rome Odunze, playing the Minnesota Vikings, projected for 47.9 receiving yards on 4.1 receptions, 0.3 on the anytime touchdown will get you 10.69 fantasy points. Number 44, Green Bay rookie wide receiver Matthew Golden, playing Detroit, projected for 49.7 receiving yards on 3.6 receptions, 0.3 on the anytime touchdown would be good for 10.37 fantasy points. Number 45 would be Indianapolis Colts wide receiver Josh Downs. He's playing the Miami Dolphins. He's projected for 41.8 receiving yards on 4.3 receptions. 0.3 on the anytime touchdown will get you 10.8 fantasy points. Number 46 is Rashid Shaheed, New Orleans wide receiver, playing the Arizona Cardinals this week. Projected for 46.6 receiving yards on 3.5 catches. 0.3 on the anytime touchdown would get you 10.28 fantasy points. Number 47, Marquise Brown, Kansas City wide receiver, projected for 39.8 receiving yards on 3.7 receptions. 0.3 on the anytime touchdown, good for 9.48 fantasy points. Number 48, Cedric Tillman, Cleveland wide receiver, projected for 39.6 receiving yards on 3.6 receptions. 0.3 on the anytime touchdown. That would be good for 9.36 fantasy points. Number 49 is Green Bay Packers wide receiver Jaden Reed, playing Detroit this week. Projected for 37.4 receiving yards on 3.5 catches. 0.3 on the anytime touchdown, good for 9.04 fantasy points. And the final player in this tier is number 50, Rashad Bateman, Baltimore wide receiver at Buffalo. Projected for 40.3 receiving yards on 3.2 catches, 0.3 on the anytime touchdown, good for 9.03 fantasy points. All right, as you can see here on the final tier, under 11 points, we got Khalil Shakir, Travis Hunter, Rome Odunze, Matthew Golden, Josh Downs, Rashid Shaheed, Hollywood Brown, Cedric Tillman, Jaden Reed, Rashad Bateman. All right, there are a few more players I'd like to talk about on the list. We're just going to go through their rankings and their fantasy points. I'm not going to go through all of their specific stats, but these are flyers that, if you are in a deeper league and you need somebody to fill up that last flex spot, this would be the wide receivers that I would recommend. Number 51, Xavier Legette, Carolina wide receiver. With Adam Thielen gone, he might get a little uptick in some usage, so I've got him at number 51, 8.89 fantasy points. Number 52 is wide receiver from the Denver Broncos, Marvin Mims, 8.86 fantasy points. Number 53, Houston receiver Christian Kirk, 8.82 fantasy points. Number 54, Buffalo wide receiver Keon Coleman, good for 8.79 fantasy points. Wan'Dale Robinson from the New York Giants is number 55, 8.52 fantasy points. Number 56, Chargers wide receiver Keenan Allen, 8.46 fantasy points. Number 57, Romeo Doubs, Green Bay wide receiver, projected for 8.38 fantasy points. Demario Douglas from New England, number 58. He is going to be projected for 8.22 fantasy points. Number 59 is Adam Thielen. He got traded back to Minnesota with all of their wide receiver issues. He could get some usage this week. We've got him projected for 8.01 fantasy points. Number 60 is Tennessee wide receiver Tyler Lockett. He is projected for 7.13 fantasy points this week. He's going to be the number 2 wide receiver in Tennessee. Number 61 is Torrey Horton, the rookie wide receiver for Seattle. He did get the number 3 spot. He is projected for 6.58 fantasy points. Number 62 would be Michael Wilson, the number 2 wide receiver from Arizona, projected for 6.51 fantasy points. Number 63 would be Calvin Austin from Pittsburgh, projected for 6.46 fantasy points. Number 64 would be Darius Slayton from the New York Giants, projected for 5.79 fantasy points. Number 65 would be Indianapolis wide receiver Alec Pierce, projected for 5.72 fantasy points. And number 66 on the list would be Quentin Johnson, Los Angeles Chargers wide receiver, playing Kansas City, projected for 5.15 fantasy points. All right, that's going to do it for wide receivers. Thank you very much for watching the video. If you got any information that was helpful out of it at all, please drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel. We will see you next time with our top 100 flex options. I should have that posted by tomorrow. Thanks again for watching. Good luck on week 1. Get ready to crush it. We'll see you next time.